Well, here we are. It's the last installment of this series, Jesus, Then, and Now. This is part 6, and in part 6, you're going to see one of the most beautiful illustrations of Jesus' patience, of his kindness, and of his restorative power. In John chapter 21, in the second half, Jesus has this really special and unique interaction with Peter. Peter's known as the rock, and we know that Peter didn't always act like a rock, but we see that God establishes that calling on his life, and Peter responds to it. In the same way, Jesus calls us into a restored relationship with him. I hope that this message encourages you, challenges you, and helps you walk in to the great purpose that God has for you now and forevermore.
It's a great morning. If you're watching online, I want to say welcome. Glad you're tuning in with us today. And regardless of where you are, I want to ask you to do me a favor. Take a Bible, find a Bible, and turn to John chapter 21. Last week, we talked about John chapter 21 and the first half of it. But in John chapter 21, there is this unique thing that takes place, this unique occurrence. And one of the things that I want to help you understand as far as the context of this goes is that this particular chapter seems to be like an added bonus to the Gospel of John. And the reason I say that is because if you look at John chapter 20 and you look at the last verse 30 and then, or the last verse, he says that Jesus did many other miracles, signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, that by believing you may have life in his name. That is a very statement that is characteristic as an epilogue. In other words, it's the ending, kind of a conclusion. But then we see that there is this, and afterwards, Jesus appeared again to his disciples. Now, I am in no way suggesting that somebody else wrote it. I don't know, maybe it was written a little bit after the initial 20 chapters were written. There's some commentators, some historians that believe that, but really the authorship of John chapter 21 is not in question. But the reason I'm bringing that to your attention today is because there's obviously an incredibly important message or series of messages that are right here in John chapter 21. Now, some people believe that John chapter 21 was, and probably accurately teaching, John chapter 21 was written for the purpose of articulating and explaining the reinstatement of Peter. Because we were left last having the impression that Peter was a betrayer. He was a denier, and he denied Jesus that fateful night before he was crucified. And then there are others who, and probably rightfully so, believe that John chapter 21 was written for the purpose of clarifying and clearing up a false rumor that had begun to spread in the early church. What rumor was that? Well, the rumor was that many people believed that Jesus had said that the Apostle John, the author of the Gospel of John, would not die until he came back again. And so with that belief, that rumor that had been spread, you can see here as I read to you the second half of John chapter 21, that John is essentially dispelling that rumor and saying that is not true. I want to contextualize it for you. Here's the deal. We don't have to subscribe to either one of those and be right. The reality is that God's Holy Spirit inspired word has the ability to accomplish many things at the same time. Has it not done that for you? You know, and in seasons of life, you'll read one chapter and you glean something from it. And 6 months, a year later, you read that same chapter and you go, oh my gosh, I never saw this before. It's called revelation. It's a new revelation that comes from the Holy Spirit, and he does that in his word. So I believe that it's very likely that both of these were taking place, but I wanted to provide some context for you so perhaps there is a little more understanding, as there is a real man with real skin and real flesh who is writing this thousands of years ago. And so we see in the first part of John chapter 21, here's your review, is that Jesus appears to his disciples, just a few of them, on the shore at the Sea of Galilee. Remember, they were told to be there because after Jesus' resurrection, Mary Magdalene had gone to the tomb, and while they were at the tomb, they encountered an angel. The angel said, go back and tell my disciples to meet me at the Sea of Galilee. I will meet them there. And so They were at the Sea of Galilee where they were supposed to be, waiting on Jesus. While they were waiting, they said, we're going fishing. They didn't catch any fish. The next morning, we see that Jesus, as dawn is approaching, is on the shore. They spot this person who's yelling at them, saying, hey, little boys, got any fish? They said, no, we don't have any fish. He said, well, cast the net on the other side of the boat. And they bring in a haul, 153 fish to be exact. And then we see that they haul that fish in to shore, and it was a recognition of the author of John himself, who recognized was Jesus. So he tells Peter, that's the Lord. And Peter puts on his coat and he jumps in and he starts swimming to shore. And then they get to the shore. All of them get to the shore, and we see that Jesus has this fire. Jesus has this fire, this anthrakia. Remember that word I told you last week? It's the same Greek word, and it's only appears twice in the New Testament. And the anthrakia is a coal-burning fire. It's the same fire or type fire that Peter would have been around when he denied Jesus 3 times. And so Jesus has recreated this scene, so to speak, and there's breakfast already cooking on the fire. Remember, Jesus didn't need the 153 fish. He already had breakfast provided, but he invited them to bring what they had to contribute. And he does the same for us. And then, to finish this story up, we see that John clarifies that this is the 3rd time, at least as far as his recording, that Jesus had appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. And so, there we are. Here we are in the story. They're sitting at breakfast, and they've just finished eating, and then they have the after meal talk. Y'all know about the after meal talk, right? That's when it's now let's really get to business. Whether it's family or whether it's friends or whether it's a business meal, a lot of times that's the conversation we have is, now we've eaten, we got our fill, let's talk. And so in verse 15, I'm going to read the rest of the chapter, if you would read with me. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. And the 3rd time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the 3rd time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. I tell you the truth. When you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he said to him, follow me. Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, Lord, who is going to betray you? And when Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? And Jesus answered, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. Because of this, the rumor spread among the brothers that this disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say that he would not die. He said, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that this testimony is true. And Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. What a story. So you can see at the very end there how it's possible that John wrote this to dispel that rumor. To say, no, that's not what he said. John's saying, guys, I don't want you to be disappointed when I die. I don't want you to think that Jesus was wrong or that there was an inaccurate prophecy. No, I want to make sure that you understand that was not the case. But we also see that there is a very important restoration and reinstatement that takes place here. And here's what's beautiful about it. It doesn't just apply to Peter, and we're going to see this morning that it applies to us. It applies to us. It is directly applicable to us. But there are a lot of observations that I want to make, we need to make today as we go through this scripture. First, we see that there is a recreation of the fire back in the earlier part of the chapter, this fire that they're sitting around. I wonder, and can't help but wonder and believe even that Peter recognized that. Think about Peter's engagement in this scene, in this moment. Think and recognize that Peter, the last time, other than having seen him a couple times with other disciples around, that he's locked eyes with Jesus in the courtyard. And he's denied his Savior, his Lord, 3 times. And the rooster crows. And so at breakfast, you wonder if they're having a conversation and if Peter's in his mind wondering, is he going to bring it up or am I going to bring it up? Is he going to bring it up or am I going to bring it up? We're not okay. This relationship is not healthy, and I know that, and it's because I failed him. And can you imagine the guilt and the shame in Peter's spirit and his soul in this moment? So understanding perhaps his, and most likely his state, his mental, his emotional, his spiritual state, helps us understand the approach that Jesus takes. In verse 15, it says, when they had finished eating in this after-dinner conversation, and he says to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these? So there's a question that's very important. And there's 3 observations I want to make about this specific question that Jesus asked. First is he refers to him as Simon, son of John. He doesn't refer to him as Peter. So when Jesus called Peter to be a disciple, he said, you will be known as Cephas. You will be known as Petra, the rock. You will be known as rock. But as one commentator put it, most recently, Simon's acting more like mud than he is a rock. And so it's as if potentially Jesus is referring to him saying, you're acting like who you were before you knew me. You're acting like that brash, that person before you knew me. So I'm going to call you by that name. Now, while that's a possibility and probably accurate, let me say something else that's accurate. Jesus also accepted Peter in his past and his present. And he does the same for us. Listen, we come to Jesus with everything, don't we? We don't clean ourselves up and present ourselves to Jesus. Jesus died on the cross to clean us up. And so Jesus' approach is to remind Peter that, hey, I called you. I called you as Simon, son of John. And you are mine. He says, Simon, son of John. That's the first observation. The second one is, do you truly love me? The question is deep. It's not a simple, friendly allegiance, but he says, do you agape me? This agape love, as you know, in the Greek Testament, Greek language and in the Greek New Testament, we see different types of love, different levels of love. Agape is a godlike, unconditional love. It's a love that promises to fulfill its commitment even if the other party fails in their commitment. It's an agape love, and this is a Christ-like love. It's what Christ did for us on the cross. It's the love that Peter declared to have for Jesus previously. And so he says, do you truly love me? You can see why that love would be in question. He says, do you truly love me? Agape me. And the third observation I want to make about this question is he says, more than these. Do you truly love me more than these? Now, it's been said that he's actually looking at all the fishing gear and the fishing boats. I don't buy that because he's sitting there with his disciples. And they're all sitting around the table. And he would look at Peter and say, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these do? Why would he ask that? Why would he ask a comparative question in that moment? Wouldn't that put Peter on the spot? Absolutely it would. And you know why he did it? He did it because Peter claimed to love Jesus more than the rest of them. I've got to take your attention now to John chapter 13. There's something that takes place that's interesting in John chapter 13, verse 33. This is at the Lord's Supper. Judas has already run out. He's already claimed that he's the one that's going to betray Jesus. And in verse 33, Jesus is talking to the disciples and he says, my children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I'm going, you cannot come. A new commandment I give you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples. If you love me, or if you love one another. And Simon Peter asked him, Lord, where are you going? I want you to notice something real quick here. There's another important observation. Peter didn't even address the new commandment. He was more concerned with where Jesus was going. He says, where are you going? And Jesus, in his grace, didn't say, hey, you missed it. He just calmly says, where I'm going you cannot follow now, but you will follow later. Peter asked, Lord, why can't I follow you now? I'll lay down my life for you. And Jesus answered, will you really lay down your life for me? I'll tell you the truth, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. You see, in the other gospel, in one of the other gospels, in Mark chapter 14, you don't have to turn there, and I'm not going to read it. I'm going to paraphrase for you. But in Mark chapter 14, especially verses 28 and 29, we see that Peter says, although the rest will fall away, I will not. So Peter is elevating his love over the rest. He's saying, I love you more than the rest of these. And so now, does this help contextualize the question? Simon, son of John, the one whom I called, do you agape me like you claim to more than the rest of these do? Peter's response, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Peter's response is this, yes, Master, you know that I phileo you. Jesus said, do you agape me? And he said, yes, Lord, you know that I phileo you. Well, let me tell you something about phileo. Phileo is not an agape love. It's a brotherly love that can love even unto death, true, but it is not an unconditional love. And I don't know, and you can use your imagination. It's not inappropriate to do this and to say, I wonder if Peter's phileo, expression of phileo love was out of shame because he was afraid to admit to that which he had claimed before. And so he knows me. I'm known and I'm seen, and so I can't claim that I love him with an agape love when I've already shown myself as a failure. And so I'm going to claim my love as a phileo love. Or is it that he knew himself and he knew that it wasn't truly an agape love that he had for Jesus? It was a phileo love. Nonetheless, this is his response. And you know, Jesus' reaction is so telling of his character, and it gets me so excited because you know what he didn't say? You failed. He didn't say that. Jesus gave him a job. Isn't that Jesus' way? Not to kick you, not to hurt you, not to condemn you. His word, he said, I didn't come to condemn the world, but so that the world might be saved through me. I came to seek and save the lost. I came to restore. I came to heal the broken. This is Jesus' way. This is the Jesus we serve, folks. And he's showing this to Peter, and he shows it to us. He gives him a job. He says, feed my lambs. Feed my lambs. And then we see that, again, Jesus says to him, I'm not letting this go. You know, that's kind of what Jesus is doing. I'm not letting this go. He says, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? Now, in this question, I need to make 2 observations. The first one is that, again, he refers to Peter as Simon, son of John, his original name. And then secondly, he says, do you agape me? Again, the same level of love he asked of Peter. Simon, son of John, do you agape me? You know what he didn't do? He didn't ask a comparative this time. Peter had already shown in his response that no, he didn't love Jesus more than them. And so Jesus softens his question so that Peter, his heart can be revealed to himself. Jesus already knows Peter's heart. Jesus is just helping him see it. So he softens the question and he says, Peter, do you at least, if you will, do you at least agape me? And he answers, yes, Lord, you know that I phileo you. Missed it again, Peter. Missed it again. Jesus doesn't kick him. he doesn't condemn him, he doesn't put him down, he gives him another job. He gives him another job, and I'm going to talk about these jobs in a minute. But this second job, it has greater responsibility and greater authority than even the first job does. And then we see that Jesus says, I'm still not letting this thing go. I'm going to ask you again, Simon, son of John, do you phileo me? Only one observation is necessary. Jesus softens his question a third time by saying, show me that you don't love me more than these. You have admitted that your level of love is a phileo love, and so now I'm going to ask you to affirm that. Do you phileo me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him a third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I phileo you. I don't know if it was simply that in the three questions and the three responses that Peter was taken back to that night in the courtyard around that fire where he had denied Jesus, and he recognized that there was three questions of restoration correlated to the three denials. No doubt that that was one of Jesus' ways of reinstating and restoring Peter. But I think to stop there is to miss a much more profound lesson that Jesus is teaching Peter and that he teaches us. And that lesson is that Jesus in his love meets us where we are in our love for him. But he has no intention or desire to ever lead us there. Instead, he calls us to a deeper relationship with greater intimacy and more profoundness, that we may know him more and he may fulfill his purpose in us and through us. Let me tell you something. It would have been easy and it would have been reasonable for Jesus to say, I'm done with you, Peter. You've disqualified yourself. But he didn't. He gave him a job. He gave him a purpose, and he raised him up, and he restored him, and he set him on Petra, a rock, himself. And he said, watch this. See, there's three jobs here that he was given. And while they might sound very similar, they are unique. The first time that Jesus asked him, do you love me? And he says, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus told him, feed my lambs. The Greek word for feed is bosk, B-O-S-K-E, boske. So it's this idea of nourishing spiritually. That's what it means. It's like to nourish emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. And also he says, do that for my lambs. And the connection here, correlation with lambs, is that it would have been a young flock. So I want you to care for my lambs. I want you to teach them spiritually. This is important. It's important for you to be faithful to what I've told you to do. Go teach them. And then we see the second responsibility that's given, as he says, Jesus told him, take care of my sheep. Secondly, take care of my sheep. Well, this word is much more profound. Take care of is spelled I'm not going to try to say this one, Poimaine. I'm going to try it, poimain, okay? If you're pronouncing it in phonetic English, which I'm sure that's not how it is pronounced. But this word is much more than I want you to teach or to nourish spiritually. It is connected to govern, provide holistically. So when I say provide holistically, I mean now we're talking about I need you to care for my sheep in every way. I need you to care for them in whatever ways are necessary. That means now we're above just spiritual needs. We're talking about physical needs. We're talking about building the church. It's important that you take this responsibility, Peter. I want you to take care of my sheep. And notice it's not lambs this time, it's sheep. The idea of sheep here is that it's inclusive of the whole flock. Now, I don't need you to just take care and teach faithfully the young lambs that come into the faith. Instead, now, I need you to holistically take care of the whole flock. What a responsibility. What a calling. What a blessing. And then, thirdly, we see that it gets real complicated. Because thirdly, he doesn't soften even though he softens his question to meet Peter where Peter is, he doesn't soften his responsibility. He instead says, I want you to bosk my sheep. I want you to feed my sheep. So wait a second, I thought he said feed my lambs, and then he said I want you to govern over, take care of holistically my flock. What about this, feed my sheep? Let me tell you what he's saying here. He's saying, I need you to spiritually care for those that are mature. And for you to be able to take care of those that are spiritually mature, you've got to be spiritually mature. You may know in your life, and maybe you're in this season, but it's really hard. It's really, really hard for us to be shown we're wrong when we think we're right. When we think we've got it all figured out and we're headed in the right direction, and someone comes along, and just as Hayden prayed before we started, he said, Lord, offend us if that's what's necessary to help us be more like you. Man, what Jesus is saying to Peter is that this is not going to be easy. There are going to be those who push against you. There are going to be those who push against the truth. They're going to be locked in their way of thinking. But I'm telling you, you got to feed them too. It gets incredibly emotional and relational and intimate and personal and all of this. But I've assigned you to that task. Church, do you see what's happening here? He doesn't even just restore Peter, but he restores him with a purpose and gives him responsibility, and he does the same for each of us. Every single one of us. We're no different than Peter. Perhaps we deny him in different ways, but we all deny him at some point. And what he does is he goes to us, like I said earlier, he meets us at our level of love for him, and then he takes it to a deeper level. Or you can look at it as he raises it to a higher level. Either way, the point is that we would grow from our phileo type love to an agape love for Jesus, just as he has demonstrated for us. See, the way Jesus handled Peter was in an agape way. And that is how he would have us love him. After this third commandment, he tells him, after this third instruction, Jesus said to Peter in verse 18, I tell you the truth. When you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted. But when you're old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. And Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he said to him, follow me. Now listen, you may say, well, what does that mean? Well, yeah, we know Peter was martyred for his faith. He died for his faith in Christ. And so this was a prophecy, but this wasn't the first time that Peter had heard that. Do you know that? This wasn't the first time that Peter had heard that. As a matter of fact, Peter heard it out of his own mouth first. Remember? John 13. He says, I'll die for you. Peter had already heard himself say that was going to happen. And then he heard Jesus say that too. Because in John chapter 13, he says to him in verse 36, Jesus replied to Peter, where I'm going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later. You will follow later. Peter didn't know that meant, I'm sure he was going to be crucified. I would think that he didn't recognize that. But now it's all making sense. Now it's all making sense. Church tradition really inarguably holds and believes that Peter was crucified. Tertullian, Origen, two of the earliest historians claim this to be true. No one really disputes it. But one of them believes and claims that Peter was crucified upside down because he believed that it was unworthy. He was unworthy to be put to death in the same manner as his Lord. Now, we have no way of proving that. Either way, we do see that Peter followed Jesus. He followed him to death, but we also know he followed him to life. And while for all of us, we might not be called to martyrdom in this life, we are called to die to ourselves. We are called to die to ourselves and to fulfill our responsibility in following him. When he said to Peter here, and just hang in there with me, we'll be done in just a few minutes, but he said to him, follow me. I've always thought that was some big declarative statement in that moment. Like he's sitting there with all the disciples and he says, feed my sheep. When you're old, you're going to die. Now follow me. I don't know that is so much the truth. So let's go back to the moment and the scene for a second. Jesus sitting around the fire, around the sea with his disciples. They're having this conversation. And then he looks at Peter and he says, follow me. Follow me. In other words, we're going to have a talk. Come with me. We're going to go for a walk. Follow me. The reason that I believe that that's true is right here in verse 20. The very next verse. It says, Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. So obviously this conversation had been happening, and it had been happening in the group setting because he would have referenced, do you love me more than these? And they have this interaction. And then he says, follow me, Peter, we're going to talk. And as they're walking and they're talking, Peter hears something and he turns around and he sees John following him. Now, if you've been here for a while, you've heard me mention this story and you wonder if Peter's like, give us a minute, dude. But the closeness of John and Jesus would have obviously led John to believe that it was appropriate for him to be there. It was appropriate for him to be there. And so John is there and he notices that. And that's who he's talking about. This was the one who had leaned against Jesus at the supper and had said, Lord, who is going to betray you? And when Peter saw John, he asked him, Lord, what about him? See, Peter knows this is how it's going to end for me. But now he wants to know about John. And Jesus said, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. Peter answered the call. We're here today because of what Jesus did for us. But I got to tell you, what Jesus did for us and has done for us is affirmed by Peter's obedience. It's affirmed by his obedience. His death on a cross, Peter's death on a cross, would affirm the testimony of Jesus, along with the other disciples who were martyred. It would affirm what Jesus did. And listen, my prayer in my life is that my testimony would affirm what Jesus has done. Is that your prayer in your life? That your life would live out a testimony of what Jesus has done. And others would look at you and say, I know Jesus is true. I know Jesus is real. I know Jesus is alive because I've seen him lived out in his life, her life. You know, this conversation that Jesus had with Peter in this walk is really interesting because it is demonstrative of how many of us have a tendency to approach our relationship with others. Peter had gotten his marching orders, and still he was worried about what somebody else was going to do. And I can remember growing up as a child and watching and listening to my parents correct me very often because it was needed. And then me looking at my brother and saying, what about him? And my dad said, I'm talking to you about you. Don't you worry about him. I'll deal with him later. You know, like just that parental, like, no, this is not about him. This is about you in this moment. And Jesus is saying, Peter, this is not about him. This is about me and you. Folks, let me remind you today that Jesus is interested in you. He loves you. He has the desire to restore you, and he calls you to a great purpose for his kingdom. But he doesn't restore us so that we can fulfill a purpose. He gives us a purpose because he loves us. And as Peter is commanded by Jesus, you must follow me, I'm reminded that that's also the first command that Jesus gave Peter when he called him. In Mark chapter 1, verse 17, those were the calls to all the disciples was, hey, you, follow me. And it was also the last instruction that he would give to Peter on a one-on-one basis of, hey, you must follow me. Why? Why did Peter answer the call? After all he had done, man, I'm sure he wanted to run away and hide. He thought, I'm done, I'm over, I've disqualified myself. And Jesus restored him. But why? I can't help but remember the story in Luke chapter 7. The story in Luke 7, Jesus is in someone's home and he's having a conversation. And in this conversation, there's a Pharisee present. And in the home, a woman enters, and a woman begins to weep over Jesus. She obviously knows who he is well before his time. She weeps over him, and she starts to wash his feet with her hair. She anoints him, and she's blessing him. And in Luke chapter 7, we see that the Pharisee says, do you know this woman is a sinner? Again, someone more concerned with somebody else's behavior and not their own. And he looks at this woman and sees into her heart, just as he sees into our heart. And he says, I love you. And he says, you are forgiven of your sins. Then he looks at the Pharisee and he told him this. He said, this woman has been forgiven for much. And because she has been forgiven for much, she will love much. I think Peter was effective in his calling because he recognized he had been forgiven much. And because he had been forgiven much, there was nothing that was going to compromise that love. You're right, Stephen, you're right. Peter has been forgiven for much, but haven't we? We're really no different than Peter at all. He gets a bad rap and we give him a hard time, but if we look in the mirror, we would see a whole lot more of Peter than we would like, wouldn't we? But we also serve the same Jesus that cooked him breakfast, restored him, and gave him a job. And he does the same for each of us. Today, maybe you've struggled with what God has called you to in your life. What do I mean by that? Call. I'm not talking about a vocation, ministry. I'm talking about just being obedient and pursuing him in relationship. Living out your faith in your job, in your community, in your career. I'm talking about serving and loving him in every way in your family. That's what I'm talking about. And if you struggle with that calling, I want you to be reminded today that whatever lambs he's put around you, feed them. Whatever sheep he's put around you, take care of them. And whatever sheep he's put around you, try your best to feed them. Why? Because he loves us so much, he sees us fit and worthy to do it. If you've struggled with it, I want to remind you, if you've struggled with it, remind you, Jesus is waiting to restore you. Will you let him restore you?
Hey, thanks so much for listening. I hope that you have been able to see just how much Jesus desires a relationship with you. You can find out more information and additional resources at our website at www.theorchardnc.com. You can like and follow us on social media and on our YouTube channel. God bless. We hope to see you sooner rather than later.